The sea was ablaze with lightning, as a treacherous storm wreaked havoc on a ship, tossing it about like a mere plaything, and threatening to engulf it entirely. Yet the crew's troubles extended beyond the violent tempest. Our protagonist found himself at the center of the attention of the ship's hijackers. His grandiose delusions of heroism were shattered by a single arrow to the shoulder. Coughing up blood, he struggled to comprehend the dire situation unfolding before him. Reality seemed strangely surreal, as though he had been transported into a movie scene. The imminent specter of death loomed, and he felt powerless to deny it. The hijackers jeered and found amusement in the pitiful sight of the feeble human before them. His endurance had faltered, denying them even the satisfaction of a prolonged struggle. How could he be prepared for this? Only a few moments ago he was an ordinary person whose primary hobby was playing video games. An arrow shot towards him as he racked his brains trying to figure out how he ended up in this treacherous place. The hijackers were done with the coward as arrows slammed into his body. He landed hard on his back as the leader stepped in to finish the momentary distraction. He knew exactly whose fault this was. He was in this position because of that scammer, that treacherous trickster. The dagger plunged towards his heart as the last few days of his life flashed before his eyes. The moment he made it home from work, he began his normal routine. Even though the time he had for gaming was short, grooming always came first. As he pulled up his chair and booted up his PC, he did his best to become comfortable. Lately his daily stretches were becoming a natural occurrence. His destination of choice was none other than Dark World. If he had to describe the place, he would say it was a place without hopes or dreams. A game filled with never-ending wars, a corrupt church, thieves, monsters, and the undead. Where the darkest of the dark ruled the world, and the dimension was in a state of constant destruction. The game didn't have the flashiest of graphics. After all, it was over 20 years old. And every day the player base progressively diminished. No other game could command his attention the way Dark World did. He had been infatuated with the game since the day it launched all those years ago. Welcome to Dark World. The awe-inspiring feelings he received from booting up the game remain to this very day. The sight of his Blood Knight character on the main screen brought him nothing but joy. His character requesting PK was a level 95 Blood Knight. In Dark World, his character was a stagnant water user. Out of all his characters, Blood Knight was his only champion to fully clear the campaign. This was because he was a true hardcore user of the worst kind. PvP was his vice of choice. Hardcore referred to a single life game mode, where your levels and items were lost upon death. There weren't many who found joy in one-on-one PvP. And even fewer who played with a character who had managed to clear the campaign on extreme difficulty. There was only one truth when it came to PvP. No matter how good you were, one day you would find your death. But as a thrill seeker, living on the edge was one of the primary reasons he continued to play this game. On top of that, his PvP Blood Knight was the strongest character in Dark World history, being dubbed the Blood Knight Master in the community. To this day, his biggest challenge was finding an opponent who was remotely on his level. But today looked promising. There were at least 2 sacrificial lambs waiting to be let in for the slaughter. His PvP requests began to dry up the moment his Blood Knight's kill count went over 500. He wasted no time replying to the first challenger, the system initiating the challenge: shake hands and become comrades or fight to the death. His Blood Knight stared down at the enemies. Alone, none of them would be a challenge. If he was going to have any fun, they would need to take him on as a team. The challengers had never ran into someone so arrogant. There was a high chance that there was something wrong in his head. But their sorceress could care less, ordering her team to retrieve his items. The Blood Knight wasted no time, beginning his show with complete dominance. His opening attack was all that was needed to strike fear into the hearts of his opponents. The sorceress couldn't believe her eyes. They were up against a pure monster. Tendrils of blood wrapped around the paladin as the Blood Knight slowly drew him in close. Wrapping his hand around the enemy's throat, he began to squeeze. The paladin's teammate stood frozen in place, watching their tank's complete inability to protect himself. The sorcerer screamed for him to use his light sword, as the paladin begged them for help. The Blood Knight had grown bored of these games, finishing the tank with a blow that sent blood splashing in all directions. None of this made any sense. There was no way a tank was taken out in a single blow. The Blood Knight silently stared the two down, until a single word reverberated throughout the chamber. The two hadn't made it this far by being foolish. Since the opportunity had been presented, they immediately made their escape. The system announcement, "The hero has left," echoed through the chamber in their wake. The protagonist stared on in disbelief at these random characters. He couldn't believe how rude they were to leave without dropping an offer on their way out. The depressing ending of his first challenge of the day had almost made him forget about his second invitation. This one should be entertaining as it came from a familiar face. Trickster29 is requesting a PvP match. He wasted no time accepting the relentless old man's request. Trickster held the mantle of the most famous Dark World player. But lately, he'd become a loser who donated items to the protagonists. Shake hands and become comrades or fight to the death. The protagonist wasted no time greeting the old man. He was impressed by the quick turnaround, seeing as how he brought Trickster to his knees less than 10 days ago. He figured the world's most famous Dark World player would have an ego, but this was unbelievable. This time, the trickster had brought a martial artist to do battle. But he had no idea how the old man had managed to put so much effort into the character. To have multiple level 90+ characters was unheard of. And it wasn't just any martial artist. This martial artist was in the highest ranking item set, the Will of the Eastern Mythological Soldier. Requesting PK, immediately inquired whether the trickster had opened his wallet just to take him on. Purchasing items and auto-forming was too much. But inside, he knew this wasn't the case. To reach level 93 in such a short time was impossible, even with the use of plastic. Trickster29 was growing tired. He had come here to fight, not to conversate. There was no way he had missed out on a boosting campaign. He didn't know why he cared so much. He was fine with it. After all, the top-tier items would be in his possession very shortly. And just like the paladin, the battle ended with an explosion of blood. He couldn't believe how embarrassing this had to be for the old man. He was getting worse by the day. But hey, he had just obtained the will set in hardcore difficulty. He closed the room while he collected his loot, only to be surprised when the system message popped up. A new hero has joined. Shake hands and become comrades or fight to the death. In all his time playing this game, he had never come across a bug of its like. He was 100% sure the room was locked down. And of all peoples, the most popular face in Dark World history, Trickster, in his original form, stepped forward. The protagonist couldn't believe his eyes. Level 100, Elemental Mage, Trickster. This was the very character that was created on the launch of Dark World over 20 years ago. Why was the old man going so far over a mere PvP battle? He had no idea what the hell he was thinking. But above all else, he was going to report the cheater for using exploits to force entry. The mage simply denied the accusation and insisted the Blood Knight attack. He should have known that the talkative Blood Knight wasn't going to let things go that easy. For starters, was the cocky trickster really willing to sacrifice his real account? Not looking for conversation, the trickster tried another tactic, teasing the Blood Knight with the honor of making him his 10,000th kill. The protagonist knew something was off. Why would the trickster be risking his main account, especially when the news got out that he was the 10,000th kill of requesting PK? A smile broke out on the mage's face as he insisted in the end, he would be the victor. The protagonist had no idea where all this confidence was coming from. His fingers stopped in mid-conversation the moment he realized there was no way for the trickster to know he had 9,999 kills. And the simple excuse of him Googling it just wasn't going to cut it. Such information wasn't available. Only a cheater would have access to his full player logs. The mage was done with the Blood Knight's BS. He initiated the battle with the awakened skill Frozen Earth. Using awakened active skill, Frozen Earth, magic damage will spread out in all directions, and the movement speed of those affected will be decreased by 100%. The eye's spell slowly crept in every direction, consuming everything in its path. The protagonist couldn't get over, being straight denied the answers he was seeking. And who in their right mind opened with an awakened skill? The level 100 mage slowly rose from the ground as the smile spread across the protagonist's face. He understood wanting to win no matter what. But the battle was over the moment the trickster allowed the Blood Knight to get his hands on him. The protagonist had no idea how the mage expected to win this battle after tossing his mana out the window with a single attack. There was no point prolonging the agony. It was time to use the special skill that was saved just for this situation. Whirlpool of Blood-Sucking. Using Awakened active skill, Whirlpool of Blood-Sucking. Absorb the target's HP. The more HP you've lost, the more damage will be done. Trickster struggled to catch his breath as the skill pulled his life force directly from his body. With only 10% health left, requesting PK was going to completely drain his enemy. As he joked about who the true trickster was, the latter began to pull an extra one out of his back pocket. The Blood Knight was simply dumbfounded. This just wasn't possible. The mage had already used his awakening skill, there was no way in hell he had access to another. Dragon Breath. Using Awakened active skill, Dragon Breath. The ultimate awakened skill of the Flame type summons the ancient dragon, Draconis, to imbue Flame type magic damage, inflicting the opponent with burn status abnormalities. The ferocious dragon engulfed, requesting PK in flames. How was it even possible for him to have two awakening skills? All this time, he believed a character could only possess one. Requesting PK has died. His bravery will be forever remembered. The protagonist raged at his desk. He couldn't believe he had been cheated. He raised his keyboard up, intent on slamming it against his computer when he decided to calmly solve this with his words. Your new hero, you cheating POS, has been created. He instantly began to throw a wall of text toward Trickster. Instead of responding, Trickster simply invited him back into the battlefield. He was fired up, ready to do battle with the cheating bastard. The moment he entered, the mage ordered him to calm down as he began to return the Blood Knight's possessions. Like that was going to make up for what he had done. But if he was going to get his gear back, he demanded all of it. His demon sword, his all-resistance shield, and his 3-skill helmet. The trickster apologized as he insisted he wasn't using cheats. But the protagonist didn't believe any of it for a second. If he wasn't using cheats, how had he accomplished the impossible? The words hidden quest came from the trickster's lips so softly that the protagonists almost missed them. There was no way there were hidden elements in a game that had been released 2 decades ago. How could something so groundbreaking slip past his attention? He wasted no time demanding the secrets of the elusive quest. The mage was very reluctant to impart any information about the hidden quest. But there was no way the protagonist was going to allow this to slide. After losing his original account, anything short of becoming OP wouldn't cut it. The trickster insisted it wasn't for the faint of heart, and that before it was over, there was a chance he would regret it. He already had plenty of regrets. He regretted ever fighting the cheater and losing his original account. Seeing as how he had no choice, he assured the protagonists that he would receive his invitation before the day was through. The moment the words left his lips, the trickster disappeared. A notification sprung before his eyes, informing him that the player did not exist. He figured, what could you expect from a trickster? Until that moment, it truly hadn't hit him. All his work over the past 20 years was gone. He just wasn't capable of fathoming what it would take to recoup his losses. Pushing the thoughts from his mind, for the time being, he would sleep. It was something he would have to think about another day. The word uncle sounded in his ear over and over, pulling him from his deepest slumber. He woke up in an amusement park unsure of how he got there. The voice of his niece grounded him. The girl was always hungry, and here she was attempting to drain his wallet once again. Surrounded by fog, he realized it would be his day off if he was here with Jaiwan. The child had been trying to get his attention for the longest. She was hungry and was tired of him staring off into space. He couldn't believe the little piggy was begging for churros, when they had only just eaten. All she knew was she was tired, and she wanted churros. She took a seat, waiting for her uncle to make the wishes of his prettiest niece come true. To this day he couldn't believe the world had made a perfect clone of his little sister. His niece was the spitting image of her mom. The moment he thought about how hazy the world was, Jaiwin disappeared. Before his eyes, a kid appeared on the bench. He had no idea why she looked so familiar. She merely insisted he sit down if he didn't want to get hurt. Her words went in one ear and out the other, not making a bit of sense. The next moment, the scene shifted. Rain was falling all around him as he was forced from his feet. The crew member was doing his best to keep him alive in the storm. Having someone space out in such dangerous weather would only end with the sharks getting a snack. The questions flowed from his lips. Where am I? What's happening? The outfit he was wearing looked as if it came straight from the game world. He was sure he had fallen asleep in his bed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that was not what happened. As he attempted to get sleep, it merely eluded him to the point where he decided to get up and do some grinding. After clearing the first chapter, he only managed to fall asleep after he boarded the ship to chapter 2. This couldn't be, it just wasn't happening. How was he in the storming ocean on the very same ship, wearing an outfit that you would only see in video games? This was Dark World and he was the noob character you cheating POS. He couldn't figure how any of this made sense as another crew member yelled at him to stay out of the way if he wasn't going to be of any help. But before the words had fully left his lips, an arrow sent blood spurting from the wound in the side of his head. The sound of alarm could be heard as attackers climbed the side of their ship in an attempt to board. The pirates were swarming the ship. Being here in person was so different than in the game, so instead of taking action, he decided it was much wiser to hide. Choosing the closest spot in range, he crept toward a cluster of boxes. The pirates were vicious. There was no chance they would leave anyone alive. Questioning all his actions up until that point, he really wished he had taken more defense. If he had only known pirates were fond of hunting rats, he would have made a much wiser decision. But thanks to his simple plan, he was now in deep shit. Multiple arrows flew towards his body, their impact knocking him from his feet. The pirates had never seen such a huge guy getting knocked down so easily. The consensus was not to give the bastard a chance to get up. He lay there like a coward, his spark to live fleeing by the second. Only yesterday he was a normal middle-aged guy who liked to play games. But here he was on the ship in a treacherous sea with no path forward but death. He closed his eyes and waited for it all to end. But as the seconds slipped by, he realized there was no pain. And the blood running down his face belonged to someone else. As he found the needed bravery to open his eyes, lightning crackled across the deck, decimating multiple pirates. Whatever had just happened was solely responsible for saving his life. The pirates knew exactly what was going on as they pointed toward a mage. Whoever it was putting on an amazing show. But because she saved his life, now hers was in danger. The magician had no plans of sitting back and simply allowing the scum to catch her. She dropped to the deck, cape whipping behind her as she cast razor wind at the VIP target, who was none other than the pirate leader. But quick on his feet, he ordered his men to return fire. The command did the trick, forcing her to retreat. The protagonist couldn't believe he was a spectator to this situation, only to have that bubble popped as a flask was thrown in his direction. She needed reinforcements, and he was all there was. Shocked, he realized the item in his hands was none other than a potion of healing. She had no time for this foolishness, ordering him to drink it and to get into battle, if he had plans of surviving the hour. That was the exact moment he got the first glimpse of her face. She was her spitting image. The pirates were seasoned fighters, and the two amateurs were giving them all the chances they needed to come away the victors. The sorceress was doing all the carrying. If he didn't get his act together, he was going to get the both of them killed. If things worked as they should, all he needed to do was down the flask and his wounds would heal. The pain instantly vanished, leaving him refreshed and ready to do damage. The little sorceress was tired of his BS and gave him a mouthful of sass. Even though he was thankful for her saving him, her condescending attitude wasn't going to cut it. As a mage, she shouldn't have any trouble dealing with these creeps herself. But having her so close, he realized that while she was putting on a brave face, she was frightened. How was she out of mana? She had merely cast a handful of spells. The pirates picked up on this and decided now was the time to put her down. She looked at him, insisting if he was going to do something, now was the time. He couldn't believe her. She had only saved him so he would eventually become her meat shield. The little mage had no idea how he could say that. After all, it was her actions that saved his life. The pirate was tired of hearing all the foolishness. He rushed in to put an end to the nonsense. In the end, he decided that being a meat shield was better than being dead. He couldn't promise he would be good at it, but he would do his best, countering the pirate's blow with a kick to the chest. Now that he decided to step into his big boy shoes, it was time for him to do more than simply die. He was going to put up a struggle. After all, he was a man and his pride was on the line. A feeling like none he had ever felt was rising to his senses. It was like his blood was on fire. No, it was more like his blood was boiling. His rage consumed him, spreading outwards from his body. With all their time at sea, the pirates had never seen anything of its like. A big axe wielder rushed in to put down the problem before it escalated. But his actions came too late, as the protagonist raised his shield to block the blow. He could feel the boiling blood coursing through his body. This was exactly what he needed. After all, he was a blood knight. He reached towards the behemoth, causing the criminal to scream for his life, as the poor soul was ripped in half. The pirates were in shock as they attempted to regroup. The protagonist rushed in, consumed by power as he finished the job. But that was the moment when things took a drastic turn. He felt as if pain was seeping up through his body, and the seething blood was attempting to control him. There was an overwhelming sense of superiority and freedom. And above all, that was an unbearable pleasure. The more he fought, the more his consciousness slipped away. The beast that remained was all it took for the surviving pirates to jump overboard. None of them wanted anything to do with the creature. The sorceress rushed to his side, cautiously approaching, and speaking loud enough for him to hear. He fell into a deep slumber as her words wrapped around his dreams. The protagonist woke to clear skies and calm waters. He immediately began bandaging his bruises, knowing he had lost way too much blood. The situation was really just too much for him to bear. How was he in Dark World? Truly here, feeling every bit of the pain that came with it. And the mage, could she really be the person he thought she was? He could tell his presence made her uneasy. He requested her assistance tying his bandage, only for her to immediately reject him. She wasn't down for the dirty job. As he looked away, his eyes caught on the tip of the flask protruding from his bag. He couldn't believe he had overlooked the existence of his own potions. His actions shocked the mage as she rushed over to retrieve what was rightfully hers. She held up his remaining potions with a malicious glint in her eyes. The moment he reached out for them, she turned away. He was forgetting that he owed her one. Her actions had saved his life. What profits would she gain if she only received a single potion? Now wasn't the time for her petty actions. He grabbed her by the wrist, insisting he needed them now. He would repay his debts to her later. The two locked eyes in an intense moment where neither was willing to back down. If it wasn't for the call of land, things would have gotten out of hand. Everything was progressing so fast. South Harbor, the stage for Dark World's second act, was in sight. The ship pulled into the port city of South Harbor. They were ordered to disembark in a calm manner as seagulls alerted everyone to their presence far above. The protagonist knew that nothing good came from lingering in South Harbor. The absence of a military presence meant that pirates and bandits could run amok. If he had arrived as requesting PK, he would have no worries. But the dangers for his newbie character were endless. He easily picked up on the gossip that there was a lockdown in effect for the entire port. Once you made it beyond the ships, bandits would be lurking. And the waters around these parts were no better, as there was an extreme pirate infestation. The city was in a state of disarray, its walls were in shambles from what looked like a recent attack. The recovery time of a blood knight was simply remarkable. Thanks to the flowing blood skill, the use of a single potion was all it took to fully recover. If things progressed as he expected, he was going to need to be in perfect condition. Just as he expected, the corruption of this city reared its head. The city guards were fully intent on shaking him down. Luckily, a thankful bystander from the ship intervened. The old man knew the language of this city's knights. He escorted them to a secluded location and convinced them to be lenient with the ship's hero. The protagonist was fully indebted to the old man's kindness. But if it wasn't for him, they would all be dead. As it was, this was the best reward the old man could give, bidding his savior a safe farewell as he headed to parts unknown. The old man was right to encourage him to be careful. His size alone attracted unwanted attention. It seemed he wasn't alone in attracting the attention of the knights. As the mage seemed to have landed herself in hot water. She did her best to explain her travel arrangements, but the knights knew that an unregistered mage was extremely untrustworthy. She made the simple mistake of trying to retrieve her recommendation letter to prove her innocence, causing an overzealous knight to whack her with the broadside of his axe. Being violated wasn't something she was willing to take lying down. The mere action of her removing her wand was enough to set the group off. Before she had a chance to act, a soldier forced his spear through the back of her knee, forcing her to the ground. As she realized she had just been stabbed, another crushed her wand. She was out of line if she thought they would tolerate the hostilities of a magic user. The group proceeded to stomp her with the heels of their steel-encrusted boots. Regardless of his feelings on the matter, our protagonist had no choice but to intervene. If the group was allowed to continue, her death was ensured. This was going to be a complete waste of money, but he had no choice. After all, she had saved his life. He prostrated himself, taking full responsibility for the actions of the brat. She was young and didn't understand the ways of the world. Her foolish actions had caused them to tire themselves out, and because of this, he offered to compensate them for their troubles. The moment he was given permission to open his bag, he poured out a handful of coins. The poor soldiers had too much on their plate as it was. There was no need for his group to make it any worse. With his words, he managed to convince the soldiers to allow him and the little one to leave. They were reluctant, as it was said that mages never forgot grudges. But eventually, they decided to leave, insisting that in the future she behaved herself. He waited until the sorry excuse of soldiers had cleared out, before helping her to her feet. The first words from her lips were words of revenge. Eventually, one day she would have it. The moment he found the safe location, he set her down and began to work on her wounds. He retrieved a potion that had originally belonged to him as she continued to stew. She was going to find each of them and make them beg for death. And that would only be the start of the torture she planned to levy in their direction. He whacked her across the head as she currently wasn't thinking straight, demanding that she stop acting like an idiot, only for her to argue that it was her God-given right to seek revenge. He encouraged her to do everything she needed to get her revenge, but she should keep her plans to herself until she was safe under her blankets. She assured him none of it was his concern, so he could just stay out of it. The potion was pushed to her lips, only for her to snatch it away and insist that it was more effective to pour it directly upon the wound. He couldn't stand this girl's demeanor, but because she was hurt, he was willing to let it go this time. The fact that she had an uncanny resemblance to his niece didn't help in the least. But her attitude and sass was pushing him towards the path of becoming unhinged. He ordered her to listen very carefully to his words. If he was to relieve her of all her possessions and hand her over to the soldiers, he was sure they would believe the story that she was a witch on the run, who kept sprouting nonsense about how she would get her full revenge the moment she killed each of you. He wasn't a part of her group, and he was sure she had put him under a magic spell that forced him to defend her. If he presented the story just like that, he was sure the soldiers would eat it up. She dropped the flask to the ground as terror spread across her face. He wondered exactly what he said that had set her off in such a way, only to quickly realize that his words must have been true. It couldn't be. Was this brat truly an escaped mage of the Lophelius Palace? This put him in a delicate situation. If he wasn't careful, he would draw unwanted attention. What were the chances that he would casually stumble upon the truth? A wanted mage on the run from one of the world's most prestigious institutes. It was the secret of a lifetime. While his story was only a made-up scenario, if she continued to voice her plans for revenge, things weren't going to end well for her. It was best if he got away from her as soon as possible before she brought trouble down on him. The moment the words left his lips, he realized he had goofed. There was no point in him denying it, so he went ahead and owned it. He needed to cut her off. Part ways. End ties. But no matter how he put it, she seemed to have no idea what he meant. It wasn't important, so he pushed it aside. Going forward, she needed to be careful with her words and her actions. She had no reason to take his advice. Violently snatching away her satchel only caused her pain. He dropped to his knees, demanding she hand over the flask he knew she still had. As soon as it was in his possession, he made sure she understood that it belonged to him. He had saved her life, and that alone was worth more than one bottle. There was no need for her to make such an ugly face. In life, when you get something, it was only expected that you receive something in return. Her rage was at the point of boiling over, only for him to take the bottle and tilt it over her knee. His actions only meant that she now was indebted to him. He poured it all the way down to the last drop. There was no point in him going around continually calling her mage. It was way past time for the two to introduce themselves. But as soon as the words were out of his mouth, he realized he hadn't thought this through. Her name was Ellen. But there was no way he would be going by Yuchid or POS. None of the names he could think of would work, so in the end he decided to go with the tried and true basic, Ajusi. Ellen couldn't believe he was okay with being called that. How old was he really? If she was going to make such a fuss, she could just call him Appa then. She quickly decided Ajusi was fine after all. He had no problem calling her out for being useless. She was nothing more than a leftover human. She didn't care for the term, even if she didn't know what it meant. He had no idea why he had to break everything down for her. The wand she was given by her master was destroyed. Without it, the only spell she could cast was Raising Wind. Other than that spell, magic would completely elude her. She wasn't a mage, she was merely a tool that the wand used. Ellen wasn't going to allow him to say whatever he wanted. What did he know? Mages were more than their ability to cast spells. They were explorers who uncovered secrets and investigated the very foundation of the world. He decided he would get this straight. She was like a chef who couldn't cook, or a singer who couldn't sing. A person like that was called a Tom, Dick, and Harry. A nobody. A defect. Or, as he said, a leftover human. He was pretty sure the term he used was the best of the three. He just couldn't shake how familiar all this was, not just because of her resemblance to Jaiwan. He had no idea why the detail was escaping him, but he could remember about 6 months ago he raised a female elemental mage who looked exactly like Ellen. He had given her the nickname IJKL Mage. He remembered the exact day that his Blood Knight had obtained the Westerly Wind Baton. It was too rare for him to waste, so he immediately created a character that suited it perfectly. He had finally figured it out. How had he been so blind? Ellen and his mage were one and the same. A character he made to pass the time was sitting right in front of him. He did his best to put her at ease, seeing as how he knew his staring bothered her. There was no point in him making himself sound crazy. So he moved on, asking her what brought her to South Harbor. He could probe all he wanted, but there was no way she was going to just spill her life story to him. No matter how he put it, she just didn't feel indebted to him. It was going to take more than a handful of random events for her to trust anyone. She was perfectly willing to throw out all he had done for her. He assured her that wasn't how things worked. What did he gain from simply doing her a favor? After all, he had already decided that he would allow her to join his party. Ellen couldn't believe his nerve. How was he going to just make that decision for her? He assured her that's not how parties worked. The two of them were equals and they made decisions after reaching an agreement. He was a skilled warrior who was versed in the ways of the world. If he had to choose a party member, he would be the first on his list. She agreed that other than him looking like a jerk, he could be right. But in the end, there was only one problem. As he said, she was a defect of a mage. With her wand broken, she was useless. He had no idea why she was so tied to it. He admitted that at the moment she was a leftover human. But she wouldn't remain that way forever. She was special, and he could easily see it. As soon as the words left his mouth, she stared blankly at him. No one had ever come close to saying anything so kind. But what did he know about magic? She had been learning magic for over 10 years. And in all that time, she hadn't even been capable of conjuring a single flame. He agreed he didn't know the first thing about magic. He climbed to his feet and slammed his hands against the table. Because even if she couldn't see it, he saw the potential in her. Her teacher had ordered her to find a particular person, whose last known location was discovered in the city north of South Harbor. That location was her destination, but that was all she could tell him. That was more than enough information for him to figure out her quest. It was highly likely she was looking for the person hiding in Raven's Cliff, known by the title of the spell thief, Psyche. As for him, he was looking for the origin of his blood, in order for him to master the art of blood control. It was highly likely that the difficulty level was going to rise sharply. For this, he needed a party. While she couldn't say the words that she trusted him, they were going in the same direction, so there was no reason why they shouldn't team up. A smile spread across his face. This was the beginning of their relationship. He reached out to seal the deal with a handshake. Going forward, the two of them would give it everything they had. He felt as if they were cheated. This was ridiculous. They had paid an outrageous sum to be thrown into a hostel that smelled like a pigsty. He wasn't the only one suffering from the smell, but this was all they had. She was going to sleep, so he had the first watch. He couldn't believe she was willing to sleep in a place like this. But before he could raise a protest, she was out like a light. He set up to be her guard, but truly, he wanted to go home. Seeing as how none of this came with instructions, he had no idea how to accomplish that. There was no way Trickster expected him to clear the campaign in real life. That just couldn't be the hidden quest. Moreover, was that old man a god? His train of thought only made him a failure at his job, as he too fell asleep. He woke up in a room of all light, with no idea how he had gotten there, or where there even was. But the moment he set up a system screen appeared before his eyes. He had no idea how this was here. This was his character sheet from Dark World. Name: me. Level 11. Class: Blood Knight. Abilities: remaining bonus skill 1 point and stats 5 points. Strength 20/30. Agility 16/22. Health 16/24. Magic power 1/0. Skills: Flowing Blood level 3. Blade of Blood level 3. Blood Shield level 2. Thirst level 2. Never in his life had he had a better night's sleep. He could only explain it away as the continued effects of being a Blood Knight. The amount of damage he received from the pirates should have left him out of it for days. But here he was, healthy in a body that was ready to do damage. Ellen arose from a terrible night's sleep. It was really just too early to have to put up with her idiocy, sly comments. She felt he really should look into getting a new hobby. Although she joined his party, the two barely knew each other. She didn't understand why he felt they were close enough for him to joke around. But before things could be blown out of proportion, her stomach ended the conversation. Over breakfast, he continued the harassment, repeatedly inquiring whether she felt different. The answer was the same the first and the fifth time. She didn't feel any different. She was the same defective mage she was the day before. He was sure there should be changes. He could clearly remember gaining access to their Dark World character sheet. There was a tab for each of them. Seeing as how he couldn't guarantee he would ever have the chance again, he divvied out both their points into their appropriate categories. For himself, he strengthened his passive skill, flowing blood, and raised his health by 2. His final stats were Strength 20, Agility 16, Health 18, and his magical power was left at 1. But he put most of his effort into Ellen, investing 3 points into Flame Arrow, 1 point into Burning Weapon, 3 points into Cold Air Spray, 3 points into Wind Fists, and 1 point into Spirit of Dance. As for her stats, he brought her strength up to 10, agility to 13, health to 15, and magic power to 23. He spent all of her points. He couldn't imagine why she didn't feel a change. Unless it really was just a dream. Being overly persistent, he demanded that she inform him the moment she felt something. She understood perfectly well and wished he would just eat his food. The way she talked to him just ate him up inside. Their morning was pretty calm. He spent most of his time pushing the limits of his body. Fully armored, he was able to cut through exercise after exercise. But regardless of how hard he pushed himself, he couldn't get Ellen off his mind. He really wanted to do his best by her, but when he invited her to join him to exercise, she insisted meditation was a better use of her time. He decided not to hover over her. After all, he wasn't exactly her parent. Meditation could be exactly what she needed to acquire the skills he unlocked in her. He was expecting the inn to be empty, but to his delight, the barmaid greeted him. As he took a seat, she insisted he was quite strange. He admitted it wasn't the first time he'd heard such a thing. As she went about her daily tasks, he asked her for her name. She turned around as light sparkled across the room, and introduced herself as Daria. It wasn't often that her customers even cared. It was the first chance he had gotten to inquire about the well-being of the city. She had no problem bringing him up to speed on what was going on. The last full-scale bandit attack had taken place over a fortnight ago. And since then, there have been rumors that they were hiding out in the reed fields. The pirates were also hovering around the city, looting any unlucky soul. Since arriving, he had wondered whether the two were one and the same. Daria confirmed that it could very well be exactly as he assumed. He hoped the city's stockpiles were up to the task, because it was obvious that the bandits were attempting to starve them out. He knew without his intervention there were only 2 paths forward for the city. It was either going to completely collapse or starve to death. After all, this was the Chapter 2 scenario of Dark World. Seeing as how his personal survival depended upon this city, he had no choice but to throw in with them. The thought alone was all it took to make his temperature rise. The barmaid assured him that it would be fine if he used the well to cool down. Ellen popped up right in the middle of his impromptu shower, scaring the living daylights out of him. She was sure if he wasn't having inappropriate thoughts about the barmaid, he wouldn't have jumped so high. He was really starting to get fed up with her tone, and wished she would do something other than attempt to start a fight. But he wasn't going to harp over it, doing his best to steer them back to the more productive topic of her meditation. Ellen assured him if meditation alone was going to do it, she would be a first-class mage already. He could tell, just by her attitude, that La Peleus Palace didn't hold back when it came to the fundamentals. She looked as if she was used to meditating to the point of being bored to death. She finally admitted that she was feeling slightly different today. Although she couldn't guarantee it, as the unfamiliar environment could be what was stimulating her. This was the exact news he had been waiting for. As he turned around, she flipped out. The pervert needed to put some clothes on. He couldn't understand. She had no problem looking at his back, but his front, I guess, was completely off limits. The moment he took a step towards her, she fled, clutching her hair as she went. He watched her go. If it wasn't one thing with her, it was another. He just couldn't be bothered with figuring her out. He had other chores to attend to. As he entered the inn, he assured Daria that everything was fine, inquiring if she knew where he could find a general store or blacksmithing nearby. She wasn't sure about a blacksmith, but she could point him toward a good store. Oreg's general goods store was located right next to the post office. She warned him that the old man who ran it had a slightly eccentric personality. He was relieved to hear this, as the Oreg's general goods in the game had never failed him. He was starting to wonder whether this world and the game world had begun to diverge from one another. The moment they stepped into the shop, their nostrils were set ablaze. The strength of the herbs and the smell of magical ingredients proved this was the place to be. The eccentric old man greeted them draped from head to toe and all black. The protagonist wasted no time explaining he was looking for something very particular. But his appearance alone was about to get him into trouble once again. The soldier look just wasn't going to cut it as the old man opened his robes, revealing he was decked out and ready to explode. He wasn't playing. If they made one false move, this whole area would be destroyed. The barmaid Daria said he was eccentric. This was not eccentric, this was straight batshit crazy. A few hours before their lives flashed before their eyes. The protagonist knew that it was time for the two to have a heart-to-heart. He knocked before he entered, informing her it was time for the two to talk. He knew it wasn't something she was interested in, but it had to be done. He apologized even if he didn't know why. But that was his exact problem, there were a lot of things he didn't know. She was just about to rip into him for making up such a stupid excuse when she realized he was right. If he didn't have a grasp on the currency system, how much could she expect him to know about culture? Going forward, when it came to these things, she couldn't expect much more from him than she would a small child. Defeated, she explained that among her kind, it was inappropriate to show one's chest to the opposite sex until marriage. From now on, she expected him to be more careful. The relief was evident on his face. He thought he had really messed things up. The two sat down at a table and prepared to work on what was truly important. For his plan to work, they required funds. But the moment he brought up money, she snatched her purse to her chest. He got up astonished. After spending 5 whole silver on her, here she was acting as if he was going to defraud her. He had jumped to the wrong conclusion. Her real problem was she barely had any money to contribute. He couldn't believe how irresponsible she was. She cut his lecture off mid-flow. She really didn't need to hear this from him. His plan was simple. They were going to solve a few problems with a single move. The two were going to head into the sewers to complete quests for the castle owner, which would allow them to earn the coin they needed. But their primary goal was to find an escape route from the city. The money was going to be used for supplies to build an appropriate layout of the sewers. But as it was, they didn't have anywhere near the money needed to buy their supplies. His frustrations boiled over, and without realizing it, he was being way too harsh. He was questioning her audacity when he realized his mistake. Pulling up mid-sentence as Ellen dropped her head to the table. He was really sure she was tougher than this. But it was probably time he started to act his age. Being so harsh on her wasn't going to get them anywhere. After apologizing, she reined herself in and the two got back to business. He presented her with the list of everything they needed to buy. She couldn't believe her eyes. What was he thinking? There was no way they would be able to manage it all. Everything was going fine until the lunatic threatened their lives. He couldn't believe how calm he was in the face of danger. There was no way this character had always been this way. And just as he believed things were about to escalate, the old man's personality shifted back to a sane businessman. The protagonist wasn't going to question it, as long as he got what he needed. It just wasn't his problem. A lantern was the most important thing he needed, along with a few other supplies. Right away, the old man knew they were headed into the sewers. He knew exactly what they needed. His first suggestion was a bullseye lantern. It had the capability to see clearly across the sewer. The list was full of basic survival supplies. Refills for the lantern, sulfur torches, and a map of as much of the sewers as they could get. It turned out that a second-floor map was the best the old man could do. The first floor had guards, and anything beyond the third floor was just too dangerous. For food, he recommended they head to the Drunken Pony Tavern, where they would be able to load up on biscuits. And while he didn't have potions, as he wasn't an alchemist, He most definitely could supply them with medicines that would be invaluable on any journey into the sewers. First off, the rat man used poison on his spear tips, so an antidote would come in handy. He continued to dig through his shelves, pulling out everything he felt the two would need on their journey. Being such a wise old man, he turned to Ellen and inquired whether she was a mage, only to have her cut him with her tongue, demanding he mind his own business. Her attitude only seemed to bring him insight, as he honed in on the little one. The grand total for everything was going to be 4 silver, causing the protagonist to inquire why simple supplies were so expensive. The old man wasn't looking to negotiate. He could take it or leave it. With the supply routes shut down, who in their right mind wouldn't raise prices? As he looked over the items to decide what to leave behind, Ellen advised him to just pay the fee. But she immediately turned to the old man and insisted if he was ripping them off, they would burn down his entire shop and loot whatever they found useful. Neither the protagonist nor the old man could believe what they were hearing. The old man levied his threat that she had no idea what an explosive orb was, only to be countered that he must not know what magical equipment was capable of. Since the moment she stepped into his shop, the old man had been keeping an eye on the little mage. But was she really wearing magical equipment? As if she could read his mind, she assured him he was welcome to test her, which only led to the two going toe-to-toe as the protagonist watched on. He knew exactly why she was so confident. After all, he was the one who originally equipped her. The unique robe she wore meant she was in no danger. The show did the trick, forcing the old man to drop his price by a complete silver. It was still much higher than the market price, but he was sure his advice would make up for the difference. The protagonist was pleased, but he made sure the old man knew he was thankful. Information was king, so he would always appreciate it. A few words were all that was needed to smooth things over, and all parties were left happy. The moment they got out of sight, the protagonist threw a right hook directly into Ellen's head. Even as she complained that it hurt, he wasn't so sure she really knew what pain was. He decided he would hold on to her cheek until he got the answers he was after, and her attitude be damned. First off, she was going to explain her magical equipment. With tears in her eyes, she slapped his hand away. She had no problems admitting that her robes were flame-resistant. He couldn't believe her. She knew that old man wasn't right in the head. If he had set off those explosives, she would have been fine. But he couldn't believe she valued his life so little. She gambled with his life over a few coppers, without taking into account all that could have gone wrong. Neither of them knew the old man, so making enemies wasn't wise for either of them. She looked up at him, understanding exactly where she went wrong. The look in her eyes told him she was sincere, so there was no need for him to pound it in. Now that they were fully supplied, next up was equipment. But it seemed they were going to have to wait as the soldiers were sounding all the city's alarms. Ellen was the first to spot the problem. A flotilla of pirate ships was headed their way. There was no time for arguments. The two needed to run. At the moment, the tower was the only safe place. But as they reached the top, he noticed the strange behaviors of the soldiers. Standing directly in the sun, the soldier turned to them and inquired if he too was a mercenary. He could tell the man had a short fuse. Seeing as how it was in their interest, today he was a mercenary. The moment the man turned to Ellen, the protagonist knew he would have to speak up for her. He covered her mouth and explained that she was his niece. And as a student, she was too young to use magic. A soldier interrupted them, insisting time was running short. It turned out they were dealing with the constable. They had received the orders to mobilize. Things were going to be tight, so all hands were needed. If they chose to not follow orders, they would be imprisoned. He did what he could to be allowed to escort her into the tower. But the constable wasn't having it. The girl wasn't even a child, so she would be fine running away on her own. The moment he removed his hand, she insisted she was an independent, but he cut her off. He understood that she was an independent mage, and that one day she would be the greatest mage of the middle world. But at the moment, she wasn't capable of performing the duties of a mage. The constable was done waiting, if he didn't move immediately he would be arrested. Not wanting to test the man's patience, he pushed all of their belongings into her arms. She had to protect their things, otherwise, all her hard work of dropping the price would go to waste. She rushed after him, but when the time presented itself, she couldn't say the words she needed to say. He was the lone mercenary in the formation and stuck out like a sore thumb. The wharf was a disaster zone. The pirates had surged ashore, leaving a swash of destruction behind. It was the exact opposite of what the protagonist had expected. South Harbor boasted well-equipped and well-trained soldiers, with a seemingly robust command system. With over 60 reinforcements en route, including 5 to 6 mages, the protagonist believed the upcoming task would be a breeze, similar to dealing with the pirates just days ago. However, the harsh reality turned out to be far from what he had envisioned. The pirates they were facing weren't amateurs in the least. Things would have been fine if the militia didn't insist that his buckler was a shield. Now he was stuck on the front line, fully open to the enemy's attack, as they moved forward as one, with him being the obvious weak point. A volley of arrows flew past their heads. The pirates were taking the blows directly to the face. To his astonishment, the crossbowmen were unloading their arrows into a crowd that was full of their own man. As he expected, the arrows weren't discerning friend from foe. The soldier to his left was taken out by the friendly fire in the midst of the chaos. The moment the thought passed through his mind that he might actually die, multiple arrows sliced through the air to make the thought a reality. Frozen in the moment his death was assured. He hit the ground hard as he was thrown backwards from where he was standing. He looked up to what he could only describe as his guardian angel. His appearance was going to get him in trouble yet again. The soldier who had just saved his life asked him to watch his back. In his current state of mind, he was only going to get this man killed. How was he supposed to fight against these bloodthirsty monsters on the battlefield? As he continued to wind himself up, he received an unexpected slap to the back of the head. She could feel his anxiety and calmly instructed him to keep his eyes forward. As he did, arrows slammed into the ground, less than a foot from making contact. Now, instead of fear, anger washed over him. But she calmly explained that she and her colleagues were going to rush forward and she needed him to watch their backs. Before he could make heads of what she said, the militia stepped around him and charged into battle. They were fully intent on bringing hail to their enemies. The time he was given to collect himself was soon to run out. He was being pushed from behind as the final group was making their way onto the battlefield. A hand slammed into his face. As the word coward registered with his brain, he had had enough of this shit. Without hesitation, he sent the soldier flying with a boot to the chest. The soldiers ordered him to drop his weapon as they surrounded him on all sides. He sighed, realizing his head was finally starting to clear. Here and now, he was Phoenix. Kim Sung-soo was someone who was a lifetime away. He gave no mind to the soldier who was charging in his direction, throwing his buckler outwards in an upward arc to get their attention. It did the trick, as he held his hand up holding them in place. It was all a misunderstanding. He was only defending himself from the soldier who attacked him in the face. Before they could give their opinion, he decided to keep things short and simple. He was about to charge in. They could be the judge of whether he was attempting to disobey direct orders. His size alone swayed the soldiers' decision. They would only forgive him if his kill count was above 20. He reluctantly agreed with the dirty scoundrels as he turned towards the battlefield. Phoenix regretted his decision the moment he threw the punch. But in the end, everything worked out. He rushed into battle, running his blade across his palm as he cast the skill blood for blood. If he was going to meet his quota, he couldn't waste a second of time. In a storm of crimson, the pirates began to drop one after the other. With each kill, his aura grew more intense. His savior from earlier grew ecstatic when he realized his swordsman had finally made it onto the battlefield. He couldn't explain it, but the more blood he came in contact with, the hotter he became. An unquenchable thirst was starting to edge its way into his psyche. His former supporters were stunned, as his hunger forced him closer to the front of the battlefield. His thirst for blood was reaching a fever pitch. The air around him was crackling with energy. and his hunger was only getting more intense. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you support the original creators. Supporting their work will allow us to continue to get amazing chapters in the series. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.